Okay, we'll be talking in the next number of PowerPoint videos about something that probably excites me more than almost anything else, and that's involving the skeletal system. I think this is going to have a significant relevance to all of you simply because probably the majority of the radiographs that people take are of the skeletal system, one way, shape, or form. So I think these next, I think probably 6 or 7 that are going to be coming up in a row here are basically going to be really important for you to understand and have a really good understanding about the skeletal system. Okay, and what we'll be studying most in this particular PowerPoint video is how we classify the skeleton, and we'll continue this into the second video a little bit later. But before that, let's get started and just talk a couple things. What's the musculoskeletal system first of all about? Obviously bones, and again, we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about bones and looking at a bunch of radiographs and stuff like that to help you understand all the lumps and bumps that are there and what the significance of all those things are, and sort of the exciting part about the musculoskeletal system. We'll also be following this up, talking a little bit articulations. Articulations means joints, and then we'll be talking about muscles and how muscles work, and we'll talk in the lab about where various muscles are and muscle groups and stuff like that. Okay, a couple things just for completion's sake is orthopedics. Orthopedics is basically a word that's broken down into ortho means correct or straight. Okay, and pedo or pedi means child. So basically orthopedics started out as being like straight child, but we know that what happens is orthopedics is really the branch of science that deals with the prevention and correction of musculoskeletal disorders in multiple different forms. Okay, as well as preservation, the restoration of the skeletal system, joints, and associated structures, medically or surgically or whatever the case may be. So let's, with that done out of underneath our belt, let's go on and talk a little bit about what the skeletal system really basically is. First of all, it's a framework of the body. If we look at our shape, a lot of this is because of the arrangement and the shape and the position of various bones. Okay, the skeleton gives us a particular reproducible shape. We have various variances of that because of various lumps and bumps on the bone and stuff like that, but it provides a framework of the body, both in regards to overall appearance, but also when we talk about respiration, the skeletal system is really significantly important in breathing because the ribs are built in such a way that facilitates the process of ventilation or moving air, in and out of the body. So it's a framework not just for giving us a particular shape, but also a framework to allow function to occur. When we do work and we do things, basically it's one bone that's articulating or joining another at a joint, and it's moving by muscles. Okay, so those bones are there for a specific purpose, not just by how we look, but also by in function. We know that the skeletal system is important in regards to protection and support. Just think if you didn't have a skull, how much chronic traumatic encephalopathy there would be, or brain injury, because the brain would be exposed. The heart and the lungs are protected by a thoracic cage, which is basically bone. Okay, so we know that the skeletal system is important also to protect various important vital structures. Okay, we know that the skeletal system is important in working with muscle, tendon, ligament, and capsule to produce motion. We talked about that very briefly a few minutes ago, that for us to be able to move, we have a muscle that attaches one bone to the other when they meet at a point called a joint or an articulation, and when that muscle shortens, it actually causes motion between those two bones. Okay, so that allows us to provide and produce work. Okay, we also know that what happens is the bones provide as links between adjacent body segments, and they actually work as levers. Now we could go into a long discussion about first-class levers, second-class levers, third-class levers, but that's something you talk more in biomechanics, so we don't have to talk about that now. But actually, so the bones actually act as a lever type of a system. Take that for what it's worth right now, and let's go on. Okay, so when we look overall at the large picture of bone function, again, for support, like we talked about, protection, assistance in movement, but also a couple of other things that I should mention in addition to what we've talked about already is mineral homeostasis. And probably the biggest one we're talking here is going to be calcium. Calcium, I've mentioned this in a couple other videos, is most important not for the hardness of bone or anything like that, although it does provide that bone a certain level of hardness. But calcium is more important, a more important type of a material that's required for muscle contraction, heart muscle contraction. It's involved a little bit with nerve conduction. There's a number of blood clotting. Clotting requires calcium as a cofactor. So to be able to have a storage area for the calcium, bone becomes really important. Okay, if my blood levels of calcium go down, what happens is, because I know I need that calcium for things such as muscle contraction, heart muscle contraction, and stuff like that, guess what? They go to the bone, take it out of the bone so they could use it. Okay, so the bone becomes a repository or a storage place for the calcium. We also know that the bone acts as a place for red blood cell production, white blood cell production, and platelets. All blood cells are produced in bone, okay, in certain marrow areas. In the fetus and in infants, what happens is most of the marrow is able to make blood cells. Okay, as we get older, what happens is we lose most of that ability to make blood cells in most of our marrow, and there are isolated areas where we are able to make blood cells. Okay, they come from stem cells. About 1 to 2% of the cells in my bone marrow and these these blood cell producing areas are able to make blood cells. Okay, and that could be red blood cells, could be white blood cells, and it could be platelets, which are involved in clotting. So that's another factor besides the support, protection, movement, mineral homeostasis, red blood cell, white blood cell, and platelet production. Also triglyceride storage. What happens is some of the marrow, when it gets replaced from being capable of producing blood cells, it's a storage form for various triglycerides. So we also find that as well. So that's a little bit about what bone functions about. It's a lot more than just giving us a shape and support, but it's all these other things that are involved, and we'll talk a little bit about those more as time goes on. Now, when I talk about bone classification, which I mentioned this is largely what it's about, we can look at bone classification in a number of different ways. Number one, the location, and that's what we're going to be spending a lot of time on today. We're going to be spending a lot of time talking about the location of how we classify bones. We can also talk a little bit about in regards to the purpose, okay? And we'll be talking a lot more about that probably when we get to the lab. Certain bones have, and also in individual sections, again, like in respiratory section, the importance and the significance of ribs and how they work, okay? We'll talk about those more as time goes along in the rest of the course. Size is also another factor, as well as shape, and we'll be talking a little bit about those today, okay? Well, let's look at the overall skeletal system. We have 206 bones, okay? That's give or take. It's not unusual for people to have extra bones, which are called accessory bones. And it's not unusual sometimes for people to have bones that are fused. It's not unusual that when I look at the fifth toe, okay, that sometimes the bones are fused there normally. They're, instead of having 3 in the little toe, sometimes they only have 2, and they're naturally fused. And those things do occur. But if I'm looking for a general purpose, and people always want to put numbers on things, which I hate numbers, but when they start to look at numbers, they say the skeletal system has basically 206 bones, and I'll go along with that. That's fine. Again, there's a few others that are there that we normally have that aren't even included, or there's some that people have that are extra beyond. There's a little bone that's back. It's actually embedded in the area of the gastrocnemius muscle, the calf muscle, called the flabella, and not everybody has this bone, but it's there. And does it do anything? Nah, it doesn't. It's just there. It's a place of ossification that occurred inside the muscle, but doesn't mean anything, okay? There's another one that's on the inside of the ankle bone called an os tibiale externum. And guess what? It does cause some detrimental effects in regards to the functioning of a particular tendon, but other than that, not everybody has it. Some people do, some people don't. There's one in the back of the ankle called the os trigonum that some people have and some people don't have, and it does cause a problem if it's there, but it's, there's just some extra. So, but when I'm looking in typical person, I'd say 206 bones is probably a good number. Most of these bones are really paired, okay? Particularly when we talk about what's called the appendicular skeleton. The appendicular skeleton involves the limbs, the legs, the arms, okay? And basically, because I have 2 legs and 2 arms, I have what's on the right side, I usually have on the left side, naturally, okay? The axial skeleton doesn't always have to be paired. Many of the bones in the axial skeleton are not paired. If I look at the vertebrae, okay, down the vertebral column, basically these aren't paired bones. So you don't have one on one side, one on the other. So I don't have that. A number of my cranial bones, or my skull bones, are not paired. Okay, some of my facial bones might not be paired the same way as our appendicular bones. The sternum, the breastbone area, we don't have paired bones there. Okay, so most of those aren't paired. But we have the axial skeleton, and the axial skeleton, if I get rid of all my drawing up in here, all my little lines, let me get rid of that. If we look at the skeletal structures here, and let me get rid of me for a minute there. If we look at the axial skeleton here, the axial skeleton are all the bones that are in white. Okay, all the bones in white are considered the axial skeleton. That's the axis, the central axis that goes down the body. The appendicular skeleton are all the bones here that appear in that yellowish color or cream color, and those are called my appendicular skeletal bones. Okay, so that's how I could divide that both into axial or appendicular. Now, let's break that down a little bit more. Let's talk first about the axial skeleton, okay? When I talk about the axial skeleton, let me just go over those individual bones and describe those a little bit. We'll be talking more about these in lab, okay? Let's talk first about the skull, okay? Now, the skull has what's called a cranium. Now, this was a word that we used before when we talked about various terms, regional terms, and the cranium is a portion of the skull that encases the brain, and we have 8 bones there. Some of those are paired, some of them are singular. The one in the front, the frontalis, the one in the back, or the frontal bone, and the one in the back, or the occipital bone, are basically singular. The ones on the side are paired and stuff like that. So we have 8 cranial bones that create this case in which the brain would be sitting in. We have facial bones, 14 facial bones. So we'll talk a lot more about facial bones when we get down to actually looking at the individual skull in a lab type of a situation. We have 14 of those. Many of those, again, are paired as well. We have one bone called the hyoid. Now, this is a really interesting bone. The hyoid is at sort of like at the, let me get my picture back up here so you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. The hyoid is here, right at the top portion of the neck, just where the base of the tongue would be, back deep down inside there. And it's a U-shaped bone, and we'll talk more about this, and I'll show you some examples of this or some pictures of this when we get to that portion in the talk about the axial skeleton in the lab. And basically, it's an interesting bone because what happens if I look at most bones, in fact, if I look at all other bones, one bone is attached to another bone. Yeah, if I looked at the knee area here, I have my femur here attached to the tibia that would be coming down from that. I mean, there's an articulation. It's not a firm, it's a joint, okay? So I have an articulation between one bone and another bone. Guess what bone doesn't have that? The hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is actually this bone in the neck that's suspended by muscle. From above and from below, and sort of like actually able to move a little bit. It's a, like I say, it's a backwards shaped U type of a bone, and they sometimes call it the hangman's bone because what happens is when someone would be hung, that what happens is because that hyoid sits in there, the noose would actually catch it and would actually fracture the hyoid. So a lot of times they look for fractured hyoid if they look for somebody who's been hung. Okay, we have what are called the accessory ossicles, and we have 6 of those. There's 3 in each ear, and that's that when if you've had like a junior high school and high school biology, they talk about the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. You know, we're going a little bit beyond that. We'll call that the malleus, which is the hammer, incus, which is the anvil, and the stapes, which is the stirrup. We have 3. They're very small bones. Actually, if you're in the lab, sometimes you have this little vial and you could pour out each of those little 3 bones. They're very, very small, teeny little bones, and they're in the middle ear, okay? And they're called the auditory ossicles because auditory means hearing. Ossicle just means bone, okay? So that's what we have. So now we have 8 cranial bones, 14 facial bones, 1 hyoid bone, 6 auditory ossicles, again, 3 on each side. When we talk about the vertebral column, we can divide it up into segments. The first segment is called the cervical portion, and the cervical portion would be this area up in here. Cervical, as we know, means neck. There are 7 cervical vertebrae. Now, when we get to the lab and show you what the cervical vertebrae look like, they look a lot different than we see as we go down that vertebral column. Below the cervical vertebrae, I have thoracic vertebrae, and I have 12 of those. Now, the 12 of the thoracic vertebrae is perfect because I have 12 ribs, okay? And I'll show you how these ribs later on in the lab will attach to the thoracic thoracic vertebrae. They actually have 3 different attachments at the area of the vertebrae, okay, and most of the ribs, not all of them, but most of the ribs have 3 attachments. But anyway, we have 12 thoracic vertebrae, and 12 thoracic vertebrae would be in this area in here. Below the thoracic vertebrae, I have 5 lumbar vertebrae, which would be this area in here. That's my lumbar vertebrae. I have 5 of those. I have the sacrum. Sacrum is this larger area, this triangular area. Let me just do a different color. The triangular area down here, that would be the sacrum. And at the bottom of the sacrum, I have the coccyx, which is basically a little tailbone that sits down in that way, okay? So basically 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 1 sacral vertebrae, and coccyx. Actually, if you look at the sacrum and the coccyx, sacrum actually came from 5 different sections that fused together, and the coccyx is between 3 or 4 little sections beyond that that create that tailbone, okay? So now that's that. If I go one step further, now I'm down into the ribs. I have 12 ribs on each side, so therefore 24 ribs. 12 ribs on each side, 24, okay? And then the sternum, or the breastbone, basically I have 3 parts. I have an upper part up in here, which is called the manubrium. That would be that area up in the top, okay? Top would be called the manubrium. Let me get there. I have the part below that, which is called the body, which sits down in here, and then I have the part below that, which is called the xiphoid, which sits right down in there. So basically, I have 3 different bones. They all fuse together. They have a little joint, and those become significant as well. So if I count all those up there, all the different individual bones of the axial skeleton, it ends up with 80. So I have 80 axial skeletal bones. Okay, so that's where that is. So let's go to now look at the appendicular skeleton. And the appendicular skeleton are basically the bones of the upper and lower extremities. Okay, they also include, besides the long bones of the upper and lower extremity, they also include what are called the girdle bones, which are basically like the pelvic bones, as well as the scapula and the clavicle would be considered girdle bones. Actually, a place for the limbs to attach to the axial skeleton. And if I look at the number of appendicular skeletal bones, I have 126. So let's break those down individually and talk a little bit about those. Let's talk about that pectoral girdle, okay? Girdle bones. I have 2 clavicles. Clavicle means the collarbone. That's this area right there and that area right there. I have 2, 1 on each side, okay? Maybe somebody even that's watching this video had clavicular fracture in the past. I know I had worked with a number of teams, and I work with lacrosse and hockey, and I would say that each year I probably had 2, maybe 3 clavicular fractures per year, okay? They're not common. My older son had a clavicular fracture playing hockey, so it's a commonly injured bone. It's called the clavicle or collarbone. Okay, scapula. Scapula is the shoulder blade. So if I look at the shoulder blade actually can sit back in there. There's a shoulder blade back there, sort of a triangular shaped bone. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Lots of little nooks and crannies which are really sort of interesting. But I have 1 on each side, so therefore I have 2 scapula. I have 2 clavicles, 1 on each side, 2 scapulas, 1 on each side. Okay. If I talk about my upper limb, okay, my upper limb starts with the humerus. Humerus is the upper arm bone. The upper arm bone would be the humerus. Okay, the upper arm bone. We'll talk more about that. So 1 on each side, therefore 2. Radius. Radius is the lateralmost bone in the forearm. Now, again, what does that go back to? What does that go back to? Sure, hopefully we'll hear it. Anatomical position, where we know that what happens, the palms are facing forward, so the bone that's on the lateral side of the forearm would be the radius. That's important to recognize, okay? The thumb side, because the thumb would be lateral in anatomical position, okay? So radius, I have 1 on each side, therefore 2. Ulna. Ulna is also the other forearm bone, which is down on the medial side, okay? And again, we'll show you these more specifically in lab, okay? We don't just want you to know the bone, but we want you to know all those little nooks and crannies and little bumps and lumps and grooves and stuff like that that are in those bones. That's important, especially radiographically, okay? Then we get what are called the carpals. The carpals are the wrist bones, okay? If I'm looking at the carpal bones, they're basically 8 little small bones that are in the area of the wrist. Okay, people will say that there's either 2 rows of 4 or 1 row of 5 and 1 row of 3. I don't really care. There's 8. Okay, they are arranged in sort of rows, but sort of like there are some that are definitely in rows. There are some that are sort of like in between, like, you know, fence hangers or one way or the other. And who really cares? But I know there's 16. Why? 8 in each wrist. 8 in each wrist. Okay, so those are called the carpal bones. Beyond the carpal bones, I have what are called the metacarpals. Meta means after or change. Okay. And so the metacarpals would be the area that we're talking about out in this portion of the hand. That'd be the area of the metacarpals, okay? So those are the long hand bones. Well, basically, how many fingers do I have in each hand? I have 5 most of the time. I've actually seen people with 6. I've seen, all kinds of different numbers, but 5 on each side normally, okay? And basically, since this portion of the hand right here is where the metacarpals are, and I have 5 digits, I have 5 metacarpals. My first metacarpal, second metacarpal, third metacarpal, fourth metacarpal, and fifth metacarpal. So there's my long hand bones, 5 on each side, therefore 10. And then finally I get to my last little things, which are the phalanges. Phalanges are the little finger bones, If I look at the index finger, the middle finger, the ring finger, and the little finger, I have 3 bones. This one right here is called the proximal phalanx. The one in the middle is called the middle phalanx, and the one at the end is called the distal phalanx. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. But then if I look at the thumb only has 2, 13, 14. That's a proximal phalanx and a distal phalanx. So therefore, if I have 14 phalanges on each hand, boom, I have 28. That's not very advanced math to figure that out. So that's what we have with the pectoral girdle and the upper extremity, but then I still have the lower extremity. Let's talk about the lower extremity. My pelvic girdle, the pelvic girdle area, okay, is basically the pelvis. It's called the pelvis, the hip, the coxal bones, and that's this in here, okay? We'll talk a little bit more about that. And the pelvis is actually a combination of 3 bones. If you look at a baby, what happens, you'll see 3 separate bones that involve that pelvis. And as they get older, these bones will all start to fuse together. They actually fuse together right at the socket where the hip attaches, where the thigh bone, the femur attaches into there, called the acetabulum. There's a little cup in there. And they're all fused right in the middle of that, as well as fused the rest of the bone. And so all 3 bones, and the 3 bones, the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis, they all eventually fuse to become one solid bone on each side. So therefore, if I have one solid coxal bone on one side, one solid coxal bone on the other side, they assign it a number of 2. Okay, so I have 2. Now, if I go from there to the lower extremity, femur. Femur is the thigh bone. That's this one area right here. So that's the femur. I have 1 on each side. Largest probably single individual bone in the body. We'll talk a lot about the femur because there's a lot of nice things about the femur. A lot of really cool things about the femur. When we talk a little bit more about the lower extremity, we'll talk a lot more about how that bone is shaped and how it's configured, which actually is really sort of neat. Okay. Although what I think is neat might not be what you think is neat, but too bad. I'm here. Okay, I'm doing the one talking right now. So anyway, it's neat. So at least agree with me for a while. Humor me or something like that. Below the femur, I have the tibia. Tibia is a large leg bone. It's on the medial side. Okay, the large leg bone on the. I didn't like that. It's actually went a little too far. The large leg bone on the medial side. Let me do this here. Let me just do it and do it this way. There we go. There's a tibia. There's a tibia right there. I'm not a good color or anything like that. So that'd be the tibia, okay? And we have 1 on each side, so therefore there's 2. The fibula is the one that's on the lateral side. It comes down the lateral side, a very skinny, thinner bone on the lateral side, and that's called the fibula. Fibula is interesting because the tibia is a very large weight-bearing bone because the weight that's borne in the foot is borne directly up through the area of the tibia to the femur, to the area of the pelvis, and up into the axial skeleton and through the vertebrae. The fibula is not as much of a weight-bearing bone, but the fibula is really, really, really important because it actually helps to stabilize the ankle. We'll talk more about that later on, how that's really, really very cool, the way that stabilizes that, okay? We have a patella, okay? And the patella is also known as the, yes, you know it, the kneecap. The little kneecap is going to be sitting right there. We have 1 on each side. The kneecap actually works because it improves the mechanical advantage of the quadriceps muscles, which are the muscles on the front of the thighs, okay? We'll talk more about that in the lab. We'll talk more about how that patella really does a nice job in improving the efficiency of those quadriceps. We have tarsals, okay? Now, where we had 8 carpals in each hand, I only have 7 tarsals in each foot, 7, okay? We'll give you the names of those down the road when we talk a little bit more in lab about the lower extremity. We have 7 tarsals in each foot, so therefore I have 7 in each foot. I have a total of 14. I have 5 fingers and 5 toes, so therefore, because I have 5 toes, I also have 5 metatarsals, which are the long foot bones. The long foot bones, this area in here are the metatarsals, the long foot bones, okay? I don't know about you, but this is also the 5th metatarsal, the one on the outside. If you take your shoe off and you feel on the lateral side of the foot, along about the middle, you'll feel a bump, and that's the base of the 5th metatarsal. It's commonly fractured. I broke mine playing baseball. I stepped in a hole when I was in college. I stepped in a little hole or a little place where I was going out for a relay, twisted my foot, heard the crunch, boom. Man, it was sore. It was interesting because the game that happened, I had one of my best offensive games that I ever had. I had a home run. My next time at bat, it was nice. But anyway, that's what I remember about my metatarsal. So metatarsals are the long foot bones. And then, because I also have 5 fingers and 5 toes, I have the same arrangements that I have in the hand. I have a proximal, middle, and distal phalanx in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th toes. And the big toe, I have one. I have 2 bones. I have a proximal phalanx and a distal phalanx, and I don't have that middle. So therefore, there's 14. 3, 3, 3, 3, and 2, which results in 14, an overall number of 28. So that gets me to my numbers as to what we're talking about in my appendicular skeleton. Okay, so you should be knowing. And if you think this is where we're ending, no. I just want you to know the name of the bone. But we're going to, like I say, all those little lumps and stuff like that. We also could classify bones as to type. Okay, not just location, but also type. Now you got to listen really close because it's going to get really deep here. You know, I have something called 5 main types. Ooh, long bones. I wonder why they're called long bones. We also have what are called short bones. The plot thickens. I'm sure that this is really getting piquing your interest right now. We have what are called flat bones. I wonder what that means. Okay, we have irregular bones. Now the plot even thickens more. And then we have what are called sesamoid bones, okay, which we'll talk about. And it sounds like sesame seeds. Maybe, yeah, they look like a sesame seed. That's why they call sesamoid bones. But anyway, and we have other types of bones which are called sutural bones and accessory bones. I'll mention just in a little bit and sort of more in passing. So let's talk about those individual main types. Let's talk about long bones. Well, why do they call it a long bone? Okay, get ready. Got your pens ready? Got it ready to write this down? Okay. No, I trust you more. You're a lot smarter than that. They're long bones because they have a greater length than their width. This right here would be a humerus, okay? And it's longer than it is wide. So therefore it's called a long bone, okay? Basically it has in this long bone, an area that which we call a shaft, okay? This area right here would be called a shaft. Okay, and then what it has is at the end it has various number of ends. So this would be a end of the bone down here, and usually at one end at each side. But sometimes that will, if I look at the femur comes down and divides into 2 little condyles at the bottom. So basically, there's an articular surface and there's articular surface in the femur. Where basically in the humerus, I have one articular surface right here. And I have one articular surface right here. This one here for the radius, this one right here for the ulna, okay? So we do have a different variable number of ends, but usually a proximal end and a distal end, but they could be divided off a little bit differently, okay, in regards to how many articular surfaces they might have. They're usually slightly curved, and this is important, okay? What happens is bones bear a lot of weight, particularly in the lower extremity. Okay, they bear all my body weight. For every step you take, when your foot hits the ground, the amount of force that comes from your foot up towards your axial skeleton is anywhere from 2 to 2.5 times your body weight because of that force. Force is the momentum, or the weight, the mass time with velocity taken into consideration. So how hard the foot hits the ground plus the mass actually creates a larger representation of force. So as a result, what happens is we take a lot of force up the area of like the femur and the tibia and stuff like that. If you look at the femur is not straight, but it's actually bowed a little bit. It spins out. This would be posterior, anterior towards the left side of where that bend would be, and that allows the bone to actually absorb some of that, almost like a little bit of a spring. Now, if I asked you what's the most important factor you think about bone, one of the things you'd probably say is it's hard. Okay, yes, it's hard. I don't want to get hit by a bone or something like that. But on the other hand, bone has collagen fibers within the bone. And what those collagen fibers do is they allow a little bit of a give inside the bone. So the bone's able to bend a little bit, which is protective. In other words, if the bone was totally 100% hard, forces would be enough to be able to shatter the bone with a lot less force than we put on them now. So the fact that the bone is bent just a little bit, and it's allowed to bend because it has a little bit of an organic part in there, which is called the collagen, is protective. Okay, so they're usually slightly curved for adding strength to the bone to be able to absorb more force and more weight than we normally otherwise would have. That's an important factor to remember. For bone to become ossified or to become bone, it has to have collagen. Collagen is one of the stimulating factors that allows calcium and this material to be built inside this, over the top of this lattice to create a hard bone. Okay, so there's that. Also, what happens is bones frequently have several points of weight absorption. If I look at, again, the femur, there's one point there, there's one point there. Okay, and both of those will share weight somewhat relatively equally. Okay. What happens is if I look at the bone, let me get rid of these things right here because there's more stuff I want to talk about. Okay, if I look at the bone, also what happens is we realize that bone has there's a couple different consistencies of the bone. They're mostly what are called compact or cortical bone in what's called the diaphysis, and more spongy or cancellous bone in the epiphysis and metaphysis. Well, you're saying, oh, big deal. I don't know those words, but you will now. Okay, this area right here is called the shaft, like I said before, or the diaphysis. And if I look at that bone, it's like a soup bone. If you ever look at a soup bone, you see a soup bone is like a circle, and then there's a little center in there, okay? And this part out on the outside is really hard looking. And that's called cortical bone. Cortical bone is the real dense. So cortical bone is also called compact bone, cortical bone, hard bone, dense bone, and that's on the outside, and that's thick. So if I look at this diaphysis, that's what we see here. We have a very thick cortical rim around it, and that center portion inside there, is basically that marrow cavity, which is more cancellous or more spongy. Okay, it's not filled with like mush or anything like that. There are little small spicules of bone that go and they sort of put like a web on the inside. If you look at a soup bone, you'll actually see how it looks sort of spongy in that middle portion right there, and that's areas called cancellous. So if we look at the diaphysis, they're largely cortical bone. They have a very firm cortical thickness in that area as this tube, like I showed around over here. When if I get to this area here, this area where the bone starts to flare out is called the metaphysis, and the end of the bone out here is called the epiphysis. Okay, so down here would be the metaphysis. This would be called the epiphysis. Okay, and what we find is when I get to that point, that cortical bone, that hard, dense, compact bone becomes thinner. So the bone is like, we'll see this later. So I have a lot of cortical bone here. It starts to get thinner, 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 thinner. And then when I get down here, I have a very thin cortical shell. Okay, and then most of the bone on the inside in this area right here is taken up by that spongy cancellous bone on the inside. Okay, so in the metaphysis and in the epiphysis, it's a thin cortical shell around the outside, but I still get considerable strength by these little struts that line up in this cancellous spongy bone in the area of the metaphysis and the epiphysis. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about that, and you'll see this a little bit later when we talk about the individual bones. Okay, examples of these long bones are very, pretty logical. You pick any one that you saw in that previous picture that were long: the humerus, the upper arm, the radius, the ulnar, the femur, the tibia, the fibula, also the metacarpals, the metatarsals, and the phalanges, because they're actually still longer than they are wide. Okay, and these are called long bones. Makes sense. Okay, it's pretty logical. Okay, long bones. Short bones. Short bones are called short bones because they're short. They're more cube-shaped, okay? They're more cube-shaped, okay? Basically, they're nearly equal in length as they are in width. So these dimensions are relatively close to the same. What happens is we see in these short bones, they are almost like what we'd see in the metaphysis and the epiphysis of those long bones. What we'd see is we'd see a very thin cortical shell around the outside, but the inside of the bone is taken up by all this cancellous or spongy bone on the inside. Okay, and that's what we see. So we have a lot of cancellous bone, cancellous bone, and then the outside I have a lot of cortical bone, on the outside as a shell around the outside. So like a very thin, a crunchy outer portion and a soft and chewy inner. Okay. So anyway, that's what we see. Again, thin, compact bone on the outside, a lot more spongy bone on the inside, mostly spongy bone. Examples of a short bone are the carpals. Okay, except a couple like the pisiform and stuff like that, and the tarsals. You know, except the calcaneus. We'll talk about what that is in a little bit, okay? So most of the tarsal bones, the bones below the ankle joint, as well as the carpal bones, the small bones in the wrist joint, are basically what we call short bones. Flat bones, makes sense. Flat bones are called flat bones because they are, yes, you are right, they're flat, okay? They're generally relatively thin, okay? And what they really consist of is actually 3 layers of bone, okay? The outer layer, okay, and the inner layer are a thin layer of that compact bone, and the inner, in the middle between that, like a sandwich that sits in here, is cancellous bone. So it's like a layer. So if I looked at, and if you'd cut into the bone, you'd have to cut through the harder bone on the outside. You get into the center, which is a long, flat plate of this soft, spongy, cancellous bone on the inside, and then you get backside, you have another cortical bone. So basically, it's like 3 layers. It's like a sandwich. Okay, the bread is the outside, and the inside, which is cortical bone, and the peanut butter and jelly is that cancellous bone between the two. And that's what we see with these flat bones. So 2 nearly parallel plates of compact bone, like I mentioned, enclosing a layer of spongy bone on the inside. They do provide considerable protection, and even though they're thin, they do provide significant strength. Okay, plus they provide an area where we can attach things to. In other words, there's a large flat area. I have a lot of areas where I can attach muscles to and stuff like that. Some examples of those are the cranial bones. If you look at the skull is like that. In other words, if we were in lab, you'd actually see this. It could actually pull off the top of a skull, a human skull, and you look inside, and you'll see that cortical layer on the outside and the inside, and you see sort of like a spongy layer between, which is that cancellous bone between. So those are the cranial bones. Another thing that's interesting about the skull is, you know why why the top of my head's not flat? Besides it look actually stupid? That roundness of that calvarium or that dome also provides strength. Okay, something that's round. If you look at when they put in sewer pipes, okay, and you have to go the detours because they're digging up the sides of the roads to put in new sewer pipes. Are sewer pipes square or are they round? They're round because the roundness provides extra mechanical stability and strength. Okay, so that's why the skull has that round type of a shape. Okay, sternum and the ribs, basically these are flat, but they work together because if I look at the sternum with the ribs, actually what we really have is if I look at the vertebrae, okay, let's say the vertebrae were back here, okay, and the ribs are coming around like this, and then the sternum is sitting right here in the middle. Guess what? What does that create? That creates a rounded structure, which is also very strong. Okay, so even though the sternum, is flat, the rounded structure of the thoracic cavity makes it pretty strong. Okay. Also the scapula. The scapula is a really interesting bone because if you could see this in the lab, if you have a bone box and you hold the scapula up the light, you actually see the light like the scapula in the middle is very translucent. Scapula is really thin in the middle, but it's a strong bone because what happens, it creates little pockets that allow muscles to fit on both sides, which actually strengthen the bone. Okay, it makes it a lot better. Okay, so those are called flat bones. Irregular bones. Irregular bones are called irregular bones. Guess why? Because they are irregular in shape. Okay, that's like the vertebrae, I mean, it's, what can you compare that to? I don't know. I mean, like maybe a deer's head with antlers. I don't know. It's very irregular looking shape. They vary in the amount of compact and spongy bone. Again, compact bone, that dense cortical compact hard bone, and the spongy bone, more that weavy type cancellous bone that fits inside. If I looked at the vertebrae would have a very thin cortical rim around it, and the top and the bottom, and then if I cut inside of it, the inside would be largely cancellous bone. Examples of irregular bones like the vertebrae, obvious vertebrae, some of the facial bones are like this, and the calcaneus. So the calcaneus is the heel bone, okay, and that's also has a very thin cortical shell on the outside, but a lot of cancellous bone, which makes you start to wonder, saying, well, geez, if I land on my heels, okay, that's taking a lot of stress, like we talked about, 2.5 times, if not more. If I'm jumping from a height, that's even more, because it's going to be the velocity and the acceleration because of the fall from a height. You know, you'd expect that there'd be a lot of force. And yes, the calcaneus does fracture when people like jump out windows, off roofs, and stuff like that. But what happens is the bone for normal activity is built, even though it has a very thin cortical shell. The way that the struts lined up in the cancellous bone inside the heel bone makes it very strong. The same thing happens with the vertebrae. These struts inside the vertebrae actually make it quite strong. Okay, we find a problem with the vertebrae in older, particularly older females, because what happens is estrogen is really important in getting the calcium into the bone. So in older females, after menopause, go through something called an osteoporosis, which you've probably heard about. What happens is sometimes the cancellous bone becomes so worn away, you know, becomes so attritic. There's so little there's it's still in there, but the gaps between each little struts becomes wider and wider, and the bone becomes more filled with little pockets of little holy areas. Okay. Um, not religious holy, but holy in regards to, you know, volume. What happens is then sometimes with coughing or sneezing, instead of having that vertebrae that sort of looks like a box, you know, like a box, it actually collapses down. And they'll have a vertebrae that wedges down like this. And that's why sometimes in these females, you'll see this big hump in their back, because they've actually had vertebral fractures where the cancellous bone has allowed the bone to just collapse down. This would be anterior here. This would be posterior there. So anyway, let's just look at irregular bones. Sesamoid bones. Sesamoid bones are called sesamoid bones because they're sort of sesame shaped. Okay, if you look at a sesame seed, it's sort of like a teardrop, sort of like, you know, whoops, that's a bad teardrop. It's bad. Okay, it's sort of like, you know, a teardrop type of a shape, or like a guitar pick or something like that. So they're shaped like a sesame seed. That's why they're called sesamoid bones, okay? And what happens, these sesamoid bones are actually existing in various tendons, okay? We have them underneath our big toe. We have them in the front of the knee, okay? And the idea is they actually lift the muscle off the bone a little bit, and it improves the mechanical advantage, makes the muscle and the tendon work stronger than what it otherwise would be. Okay, so they're basically in the areas where there's a lot of friction or tension or stress, and actually on the back side of the patella will actually be a joint surface that actually fits against the femur, so it does articulate with the femur on the posterior side of the patella. They're not always ossified. In fact, sometimes what will happen is some of these sesamoid bones, if you have them at the base of the big toes, okay, right, the big toe, over the first metatarsal, but you also have them frequently in the thumbs right here, but usually you don't see them radiographically. You may. If you take an x-ray of a hand, do not be surprised if you see two little lumps of bone on the base of the thumb, right in this area, and those are just sesamoid bones. But in most cases you don't see them, because most cases they're cartilage. They don't ossify. Okay, so they're not always ossified, and some people they will be, some people they won't be. So if you see those, they'll say, oh my gosh, I got to get a copy of this because this is really cool. Guess what? Yeah, it might be cool because you don't see it all the time, but it's not unusual and it's not rare. Okay, and what they do is, again, they protect the tendon from excessive wear and tear. And by changing the direction of the tendon, they actually improve the mechanical advantage of a particular muscle. Again, the examples are the patella, the kneecap, okay, up in here, and the ones underneath the big toe, or the plantar sesamoids, or they're called hallux sesamoids. The word hallux, H-A-L-L-U-X, H-A-L-L-U-X, H-A-L-L-U-X means big toe. Okay, so if you see the hallux sesamoids or the patella, they're both sesamoid bones. Okay, there are other bones that we have. Some of them are called sutural bones. Okay, now what are sutures? Sutures are joints. Okay, when you look inside at the skull, you know, if you go to like a Halloween shop or something, they got all these phony plastic skulls. You look at all the bones; they have these little squiggly lines between all those bones. The little squiggly lines. Okay, they look sort of squiggly and stuff like that. And these bones are these lines are called suture joints. Okay, and basically they're little teeth that fit inside each other that provide considerable strength when they eventually fuse. Okay, and you'll see the little remnants of where that joint is. Sometimes we actually will have a little piece of bone between these sutural joints. In other words, it'll be solid, okay, but there'll be a little extra little piece of bone, and those are called sutural bones. Okay, they're located within these suture joints of the cranial bones. Again, they don't have to be there. They're not unusual. They're not rare. It's not like, oh my gosh, we got to put this one in a museum because nobody's ever seen this before, because it's not like that. Okay, we also have what are called accessory bones. Okay, and accessory bones are bones that may or may not be there. Okay, and again, like I mentioned when I talked earlier on, there are some bones in the foot on the medial side of the arch. It's called the ostibial sternum. There's one in the back of the heel, or the back of the ankle, which is called the ostrigonum. They are just parts of the bone that might not have fused, and they become what are called accessory bones. And again, they're not unusual. They're not rare. I've seen tons of these. They may cause problems physically, but basically they're not really something that's a rarity. Okay, and these are just called accessory bones. So what have we talked about here so far? We've talked about a couple different ways to classify bones. We talked about classifying bones in regards to location. Location, axial skeletal bones versus appendicular. Axial, center of the body, skull, vertebrae, and so forth, okay? And ribs and sternum, okay? Appendicular means limbs, both the shoulder girdle, the pelvic girdle, as well as the legs and the arms. So we could classify bones that way, and you could look at the numbers and stuff like that and think about those numbers, okay? So that's one way we've been able to classify bones. We've also been able to classify bones a little bit by type. Long bones, short bones, irregular bones, flat bones, sesamoid bones, and other types of bones, okay? Just by their shape, by how they're formed, okay? And that also makes a difference in regards to the composition, in regards to that dense, cortical, compact, hard bone. And you're going to be hearing this over and over and over again over the next number of videos. Dense, cortical, compact, hard bone versus I can't say soft, because it's I guess maybe it's softer than cortical bone. I hate to say soft. I'd rather say spongy, because it looks more like a sponge when you look at it. Spongy bone, cancellous bone, also called trabecular bone or medullary bone. There are a lot of different names for that bone. I hate to use the word soft because it's really not soft, but it is more spongy looking. So we've been able to classify bones a couple different ways, by location as well as by a little bit by shape. Okay, and we'll be talking a little bit more about other ways we classify bones in upcoming PowerPoint videos. So, but for now, I'm going to leave you with this. Hopefully, this will make sense to you. And again, as always, if you have any questions, you can always ask, email me, whatever the case may be. And also, most importantly, be safe and be healthy. Okay, and we will talk to you.